I've always loved night hiking. Something about the serenity of the woods under a full moon soothes my nerves in a way nothing else can. But last Friday, my usual trail, the one I'd walked countless times, felt different. The peace I'd always associated with it had been replaced by something I couldn't quite place. I started the hike just as I usually did, flashlight in hand, boots crunching against the gravel path. The familiar sounds of the forest were comforting at first. The occasional chirp of a cricket, the rustling of leaves in the wind, all of it created a natural symphony that I found soothing. But about 20 minutes into the hike, the sounds began to fade. It happened gradually at first. The crickets went quiet, followed by the absence of rustling leaves. Soon there was nothing but the sound of my own footsteps. I paused and turned off my flashlight, trying to let my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the trees. The silence was unnerving. I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the animals had sensed me and gone still, as they often did when they felt threatened. That made sense, right? I pressed on, my nerves tingling with unease. About half an hour in, I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle. That's when I saw it, a tall, dark shape standing among the trees about 50 feet ahead. At first, I thought it was just a shadow cast by a trick of the moonlight. I squinted, trying to make out more detail, but then it moved, slowly, deliberately, toward me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen in place, my feet rooted to the ground, as if the forest itself had claimed me. I shone my flashlight toward the figure, but the beam of light only seemed to make it angrier. Its movements became erratic, almost as if it was dancing in the shadows. It wasn't a person. I could tell that much. It was too tall, its limbs too gangly. The way it moved reminded me of a marionette with tangled strings, jerky and unnatural. Its head tilted at an impossible angle, and I caught a glimpse of eyes that reflected the light in a way that no human eyes could. I tried to call out, but no sound came from my throat. My heart was pounding so loudly that it drowned out any thought of logic or reason. I turned off my flashlight and crouched low to the ground, hoping the darkness would hide me. The figure stopped about 20 feet away. It didn't move for what felt like an eternity. And then it began to sniff the air, like a predator searching for its prey. I pressed myself closer to the ground, my palms digging into the dirt. The earthy smell was overwhelming, but I didn't dare move. The thing let out a low, guttural sound, a mix between a growl and a groan that sent shivers down my spine. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it turned and disappeared into the trees. I waited for several minutes, too terrified to move. When I finally felt brave enough to stand, my legs were shaking so badly that I stumbled. I shone my flashlight in every direction, searching for any sign of the figure. The forest seemed normal again. The sounds of crickets and rustling leaves returned, but they no longer felt comforting. I didn't waste another second. I bolted back toward the parking lot, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I tripped over roots and rocks, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I ran. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified. When I finally reached my car, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. As I drove away, I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure chasing me. But the road was empty. I haven't been back to that trail since. I haven't gone hiking at all. The woods, once my sanctuary, now feel like a place I'm not supposed to be. I've tried to rationalize what I saw that night. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or my imagination running wild, but deep down I know the truth. There's something in those woods, something that doesn't belong, and it's watching. When I was 10 years old, my family moved to a small rural town surrounded by dense woods. Our new house was right on the edge of the forest, and my bedroom window had a clear view of the towering trees. During the day, the woods seemed peaceful, even inviting. But once night fell, it felt like an entirely different place. A few weeks after we moved in, I started noticing something strange. Most nights were quiet, aside from the occasional chirping of crickets or an owl hooting in the distance. Then one night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft tapping against my window. I froze instantly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake my parents. The tapping wasn't random or accidental. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and almost patient. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block out the sound and convince myself it was nothing. Eventually the noise stopped, and I must have fallen asleep. The next morning I checked the window, expecting to find a branch or something brushing against it. There was nothing. The glass was clean, and the trees were a good distance away. For the next few nights, the tapping came back, louder each time. It started feeling intentional, like it wanted my attention. I tried telling my parents, but they waved it off like it was nothing. My dad suggested it was probably just a bird or a squirrel causing the noise. He shrugged as if that explanation should comfort me, but I knew better. One night I decided I needed to see what was happening. I grabbed a flashlight and a notebook, determined to prove it wasn't just my imagination. When the tapping started, I crept toward the window and shone the flashlight outside. What I saw made my stomach drop. There was someone or something standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall and thin, its body hidden in the shadows. Its face wasn't visible, but its eyes caught the light, glowing faintly as they stared back at me. I panicked and stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. By the time I looked again, it was gone. The next morning, I tried explaining to my parents what I'd seen. My mom looked concerned, but my dad brushed it off again, laughing and saying I'd probably been dreaming. But I knew what I'd seen. That night, the tapping spread. It wasn't just at my window anymore, it was at the back door too. The sound moved around the house like it was testing every entry point. I stayed in my room, too terrified to move. When the tapping finally stopped, I thought it was over. That's when I heard a voice. At first, it was faint, barely audible, but it grew louder, more persistent, and unmistakable. It was calling my name, drawing it out slowly, almost playfully. Hearing my name like that, whispered in a sing-song tone, sent chills down my spine. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but it didn't help. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It felt like it was in my head. The next morning, I noticed something strange near the edge of the woods. The grass was trampled, flattened as though something heavy had been pacing back and forth. My dad insisted it was probably deer tracks, but I wasn't convinced. That night, I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. When the tapping started again, I forced myself to confront it. I opened the window a crack and shouted into the dark, asking what it wanted from me. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a voice answered. It was low and gravelly, but somehow familiar. It told me to come outside. I slammed the window shut and locked it, my hands trembling. The voice didn't stop. It kept repeating my name, coaxing me to step out into the dark. The next day, I told my best friend, Sarah. She was the only one who didn't think I was crazy. She offered to stay over that night to help figure out what was going on. We stayed up late, sitting by the window. When the tapping started, Sarah grabbed my arm, her face pale. She asked me if that was what I'd been hearing. I nodded, too scared to speak. This time, the figure didn't stay at the tree line. It stepped closer, the glowing eyes fixed on us, unblinking. Sarah whispered that we needed to do something, but I couldn't move. When I finally managed to grab the flashlight, I aimed it at the figure. It let out a piercing screech and retreated into the woods. Neither of us slept that night. The next morning, Sarah convinced her older brother Jake to check the woods with us. He wasn't exactly thrilled about it, but he agreed. We followed the flattened grass into the forest. About 50 yards in, we found a clearing that made my stomach churn. The trees around it were stripped of their bark, claw marks gouged deep into the wood. In the center of the clearing was a pile of bones. Most were small birds, squirrels, but there were a few larger ones that looked disturbingly human. Jake muttered that we needed to leave immediately. He said I couldn't stay in that house any longer. That was the last night I ever spent in that home. My parents were angry when I refused to go back, but eventually they sold the place. To this day, I still dream about the woods. The tapping, the voice, the glowing eyes, they never really left me. Sometimes I wake up feeling like they're still there, watching me from the shadows. I never thought much about the woods near my grandparents' house. They were just there, part of the scenery. As a kid, I spent summers climbing trees and chasing fireflies without a second thought. My grandparents used to tell me not to wander too far, but I always figured they were just being overprotective. Last autumn, though, when I stayed with them for a month, I finally understood what they were warning me about. It started during one of my evening walks. The sun was going down and everything had that golden glow, with shadows stretching across the ground. I was walking this narrow dirt path that looped around the property, enjoying the sound of the leaves crunching under my boots. About halfway through, I noticed something was off. The woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no bugs, nothing. Just this heavy, suffocating quiet. It was weird enough to make me stop and look around. That's when I saw it. It was about 50 yards away, standing between the trees. Tall, like 7 or 8 feet tall, and ridiculously thin. Its skin looked pale and mottled, kind of like tree bark, and its head was tilted to the side like it was watching me. At first I thought it had to be a shadow or maybe a dead tree, but then it moved. Not much, just a shift in the way it stood, like it was leaning or adjusting its weight. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I made myself turn and walk back toward the house. I didn't run, even though I wanted to. Something told me running would be a mistake. When I got back, my grandmother was in the kitchen humming while she cooked dinner. I didn't tell her what I saw. I convinced myself I was imagining things, but later that night, I was lying in bed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Around midnight, I woke up to this tapping sound at the window. My room was on the second floor, so my brain immediately went, "No way something's outside." But the tapping didn't stop. It was slow and steady, like whatever it was wanted me to know it was there. I finally worked up the nerve to look, and there it was again. The same figure, standing just beyond the edge of the backyard. Its head was tilted the same way as before, and its eyes were glowing. I stumbled back from the window, trying to catch my breath. The tapping stopped, but it didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me. The next morning, I told my grandfather about it. He didn't seem surprised. He just sighed and said he was hoping I wouldn't notice anything. He explained that there's something in those woods. It's been there for as long as he can remember. It doesn't bother anyone as long as they leave it alone. But if you see it and it notices you, then things get complicated. I didn't want to believe him, but deep down I knew he was right. For the next few days I stayed inside after dark, keeping all the curtains closed. It didn't matter. The tapping came back every night, louder and more persistent. On the 4th night I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, ignoring my grandparents when they tried to stop me. My grandfather warned me that going out there would only make things worse, but I didn't care. I needed it to stop. The air was freezing as I stepped into the backyard. The flashlight barely lit up the edge of the trees, but I called out anyway, asking who was there. At first, nothing happened. Then, it stepped out from the shadows. It moved slow, like it had all the time in the world. Up close, it was even worse. Its limbs were too long, and its joints bent in ways that didn't make sense. Its eyes weren't glowing, they were reflecting the light, like a predator's. It raised one of those long arms and pointed toward the woods. I just stood there, frozen. My heart was racing, and I kept thinking, I am not going in there. It tilted its head again, almost like it was amused, and I swear it looked like it was smiling. This twisted, awful kind of smile. Then, just like that, it turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, my grandparents and I decided to leave. We packed up and never went back to that house. Even now, though, I sometimes hear tapping late at night. When I look out the window, I could swear I see it standing there just at the edge of the light, waiting. There was some. Growing up in a little mountain town surrounded by endless forests, the woods were always part of my life. I spent most of my childhood exploring, climbing trees, and imagining grand adventures. But there was one place everyone avoided: the hollow pines. People whispered about it, a patch of forest where anyone who ventured in was never seen again. As a kid, I brushed it off as just another spooky story to keep us from wandering too far. That changed one late October evening. I'd been hiking with some friends, but as the sun dipped lower, we somehow got separated. My phone was completely dead, and all I had was a small flashlight. Desperation set in, and I thought cutting through the hollow pines might be the fastest way back to the main trail. The moment I stepped in, I knew it was a mistake. The air felt different, colder and heavy, like it was pressing down on me. The trees were bizarrely tall and twisted, their branches weaving together to block out most of the remaining light. Even the ground beneath my feet felt wrong, soft, almost like it was alive. I told myself to keep moving, that it was just another part of the forest, but it didn't feel normal. The usual sounds of the woods were missing. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets. Instead, there was this strange hum, a low vibration that seemed to resonate in my chest. After about 20 minutes, I came across something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There was a circle of stones sitting right in the middle of the path, each one carved with weird symbols that glowed faintly. In the center of the circle lay a single, oversized black feather, shiny and unnaturally perfect. Everything in me screamed to turn back, but when I turned, the path I'd been following was gone. All I saw were endless rows of identical trees, their branches swaying slightly even though there was no wind. That's when panic kicked in. I started moving faster, then running, the flashlight bouncing all over as I searched for anything familiar. The hum got louder, almost deafening, and with it came this creeping feeling that I wasn't alone. Calling out didn't help. My own voice echoed weirdly, like the forest was swallowing it. Then, ahead of me, I spotted something. A figure stood between the trees. It was tall, freakishly thin, with limbs that seemed too long. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but somehow I could feel its gaze, a cold, piercing stare. I froze, barely managing to get out a shaky hello. The figure didn't respond, just raised one impossibly long arm and pointed to the right. There, in the distance, a faint light flickered. Every part of me wanted to run the other way, but I was lost and desperate. Slowly, I started walking toward the light, keeping one eye on the figure. It didn't move or follow, just stood there, watching. As I got closer, the light grew stronger, revealing a small clearing. In the middle of it stood a little cabin, warm light glowing from its windows. Smoke curled from the chimney, and I could hear faint music coming from inside. Relief washed over me. Finally, I thought I'd found safety. I rushed to the door and knocked. Nothing. Knocking harder didn't help. There was no answer. Hesitantly, I tried the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a cozy scene straight out of a storybook: plush chairs, a roaring fire, and a table laid out with steaming bowls of soup. I called out again and stepped inside. The moment I did, the door slammed shut behind me. Spinning around, I saw no one there. The music had stopped, replaced by that awful hum, louder than ever. The room began to change. The walls stretched upward, warping into dark, twisted shapes that looked like the trees outside. The fire went out, leaving me in pitch black. Then I saw them, eyes, dozens of them, glowing in the darkness, all fixed on me. I tried to back away, but the cabin was gone. I was back in the woods, standing right in the middle of that stone circle. The symbols carved into the stones glowed brighter, and the eyes kept getting closer. Whispers filled the air, soft and indistinct. but coming from everywhere at once. What happened next is still a blur. There were flashes of movement, a blinding light, and the sensation of being pulled through something thick, like trying to move through water. When I came to, I was lying on the main trail, the morning sun breaking through the trees. My friends were standing over me, pale and panicked. They said I'd been gone all night. I tried to tell them what happened, but the words got stuck in my throat. All I could do was gesture toward the hollow pines. At first they didn't believe me, but later when we retraced my steps, we found the stone circle. The symbols were still glowing faintly. We left the woods that day and swore never to go back. Even now, sometimes late at night, I hear that hum again, and when I close my eyes, I see the eyes staring back at me, still waiting. There was some. Camping has always been my thing, especially in those remote spots where the stars look like they're about to fall out of the sky, and the world feels so still. So when my buddy Nate brought up the idea of spending the weekend in Black Hollow Forest, I was all in. Sure, I'd heard the stories about the place, how the trees whisper at night, and how people feel like they're being watched, but I brushed it off as nothing more than spooky campfire tales. We got there early on a Saturday morning, hiking way deep into the woods to find a spot that felt untouched. The air had that crispness that makes you breathe a little deeper, and the sunlight coming through the tall pines made everything look golden. It was one of those moments that felt peaceful, almost enchanted. By late afternoon, we had our tent set up, the fire going, and dinner cooking. The forest around us was dead quiet, but we didn't think much of it. Nate made some crack about how maybe the trees would come to life and drag us away. I laughed along, but deep down, there was this tiny itch of unease I couldn't quite shake. When night fell, everything felt different. The air got colder, and the quiet turned into something that felt heavy. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the kind of silence that makes you start listening for things that might not even be there. The fire crackled, and we talked now and then, but there wasn't much else. Around midnight, Nate decided to call it a night and crashed in the tent. I stayed by the fire, enjoying the warmth and the stillness, or at least I tried to. That's when I caught a faint rustling sound in the trees behind me. At first, I figured it was some animal, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It wasn't darting or scurrying. It was slow and deliberate, like careful footsteps. I called out for Nate, wondering if maybe he had come back out of the tent, but there was no answer. The rustling got louder, like it was coming closer. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, cutting through the dark with that sharp beam of light. Nothing was there, just trees and underbrush, but the noise didn't stop. My heart started hammering in my chest as I stood up and swept the light across the woods. That's when I saw it. There was this shadowy figure just beyond the edge of the light. It was tall, too tall, with these elongated limbs that didn't look quite right. And its head, something about it was off, like it was too small for its body. I tried calling out again, but my voice barely came out. The thing just stood there, not moving, like it was studying me. I felt like a mouse under the gaze of a hawk. Slowly, I started backing up toward the tent, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I whispered Nate's name, hoping he'd wake up, but I didn't dare take my eyes off whatever that thing was. Out of nowhere, the fire went out, leaving me in complete darkness. I scrambled into the tent and shook Nate awake, my voice low and panicked, telling him there was something out there. Groggy, he grabbed his flashlight and peeked outside, but he said he couldn't see anything. His voice wasn't exactly convincing, though. We sat there, both of us on edge, straining to hear anything. The rustling had stopped, but the silence was somehow worse. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. I started to think maybe we'd imagined the whole thing. Then the tent moved. It was subtle at first, just a little tug, but then it got more forceful, like something was clawing at it. Nate unzipped the tent a tiny bit and shone his flashlight out. What we saw made my stomach drop. Its face, or lack of one, was the worst part. It had no features, just this blank, smooth void where a face should have been. It tilted its head like it was curious about us, then reached out with one of those impossibly long arms. Nate didn't hesitate. He yanked me up, and we bolted out of the tent, running as fast as we could. Our flashlights bounced wildly, the beams catching nothing but the endless trees around us. Behind us, I could hear heavy footsteps pounding the ground, keeping pace with us. Somehow we made it back to the trailhead just as dawn started creeping in. The second we stepped out of the forest, everything stopped. The footsteps, the sense of being chased, all of it was just gone. We turned back, half expecting to see it standing at the edge of the woods, but there was nothing. Just the trees, silent and still. Nate and I never brought it up again. When people asked why we cut the trip short, we mumbled something about bad weather. But I can't shake it. Sometimes, late at night, I'll close my eyes and I'm back there, staring at that faceless thing crouched in the shadows, waiting for its next move. There was something.